The idea of business partnerships often look great on paper or in theory, but I want to explain why they usually fail. Most business owners think that having a partner will help them double their speed and halve their stress. But often it does the opposite. It doubles conflict and it halves the peace that they experience. Studies actually show that between 50% and 80% of all business partnerships will eventually dissolve. And I think surprising to a lot of people, 65% of high potential startups will actually fail because of conflict between the founders. So in this video, I want to walk you through the 6 make it or break it areas that determine whether your partnership will thrive or explode, and how to protect yourself before you ever sign with someone on the dotted line. And this matters because some of the largest and most successful organizations are actually the result of partnerships. So partnerships are valuable, and they often are the way to significant success, but they don't happen on accident. At the end of the video, I want to show you the single trait that predicts partnership failure or success more reliably, in my opinion, than anything else. So when you look at partnerships, it's interesting to think about how seasoned investors, let's say angel investors or many private equity directors, will often look at the owners of the companies that they're thinking about investing in, and they'll often say things like, I invest in the person, not so much in the business. Now, obviously, they're looking at the business as well, but they're paying attention to the person, and that illustrates my first point, that character is one of the primary traits or characteristics that you do need to pay attention to. Similar to a marriage, you want to make sure that you're marrying somebody or tying yourself to somebody who has the kind of values and the kind of perspective that you can work well with. In my experience, there are 2 major issues that tend to break relationships in partnerships. One is questions around integrity, and the second are questions around or feelings that one partner or the other is not acting respectfully or doesn't respect the other person. And so I would say those 2 character traits, they're not the only ones for sure, but I would say those 2 character traits are pretty important because they show up every single time, one or the other, if not both, when I'm working with partners that are in a dispute. Integrity or something related to integrity, or respect, and that desire to feel respected by your partner. So those are 2 things to look forward to, or not to look forward to, but to look for. The third thing that I would look for is a capacity for growth. Is your partner somebody who works on their stuff, that it has enough self-awareness to see that they're not a completely perfect finished product, or they're not so defensive and guarded that they don't want to allow anybody in, or acknowledge that perhaps there's room to grow. In my experience, that if you're going to have a long-term relationship with people, it works best if they're people who are also pursuing growth and trying to become bigger and more complete and more whole as they age and as they progress through life. And so those 3 traits, you also want to look at other traits as well. You might be interested in their work ethic. You might be interested in, whatever character traits are important to you. But I would say integrity, respect, and this pursuit of ongoing growth are key, because if you have those things, it allows you to have a lot of other potential and to work through problems, which is really the main thing. The second aspect that I think is important is alignment on values, vision, and priorities. Now, this is related to character, but this has to do with the individual themselves. You want to have alignment with each other around what are the values that guide our decision making and guide the behaviors that we think are appropriate for us as partners, but also for the entire company, the culture that we're trying to create. You might feel like people you meet on a first date and you fall in love and you're infatuated and all of that, and you just feel like this is so magical. How can it not be an amazing thing? And then later you discover they're a human being and this takes work. It's the same thing with partnerships. You want to make sure that there's a clear alignment and that you don't just fall in love and get infatuated with the idea of all of the business success that you're going to have. It's super easy to do that. And in business, in romance, people kind of expect people to be thinking with their heart, not their head. And we almost expect the opposite of that in business or nonprofits or whatever. But the reality People are emotional beings, and they get sucked up into the emotion of potential and the future and all of that. And they're often not very clear or aligned about what values do we share and what are we really trying to build together. And you'll often find in partnership disputes that they didn't really articulate what they were trying to build together. And so they're trying to build things separately, and the tension is that they're pursuing different goals. The other thing that you want to be able to have alignment on is nearer term priorities. So vision is ultimately, what are we trying to do? We're trying to build a company and we want to get to this size and we're hoping to sell it in 10 years. That's aspects or components of a vision. Priorities has to do with what do we need to get done this year. It's the way I'm defining this, at least. When you have alignment around these, partnerships tend to have a much less friction. They just tend to work together because everybody's aligned. They're trying to get to manifesting or living out the same values. They're trying to accomplish the same things, and they have the same sense of how do we get there. This alignment is very important. And when you see disputes, it's often because of a lack of alignment. And correcting disputes is often a simple matter of creating that alignment. And once that's there, a lot of problems just go away. It's kind of amazing how many organizational issues are just tied to a lack of alignment in that space. And that also ties to this next one, which is related to alignment. A lot of these kind of are related topics that flow from one to the next. But this has to do with role clarity. Frequently in partnerships, there isn't a differentiation in roles. And especially when you're starting a business, especially if you're bootstrapping a business, there's a sense of all hands on deck. We all wear all the hats all the time, and we're all just trying to do whatever it takes, and we all have to be willing to do whatever it takes to make the business work. And there's some value in that perspective and that ethic and that willingness, but you cannot, I'll just say that a third time, you cannot build a business very far if everybody's wearing all the hats all the time, because it becomes very confusing and very overwhelming for everybody. You want to begin to develop clarity as soon as is feasibly possible regarding who has what role in the company, who is responsible for what basic responsibilities, what decisions, what authority frameworks fit under each partner. You want to be clear about that. And then this other aspect, and I talk about this more in other videos, you want to differentiate the expectations around the owner hat that people wear and the employee or operator hat that people wear. And this becomes a source of significant conflict in partnerships when there's not an understanding that even though you're the same person and you may own a lot of both of these, they aren't the same role. And the expectations of an employee are not the same thing as an owner. An owner's an investor. An owner is someone who has an asset that they're hoping will grow and will do well. They don't have to work in the business. I own stock in companies, but I don't work in those companies. It doesn't intrinsically go together. They can, but they don't have to. Additionally, everybody knows you can be an employee in a company and not an owner. So these are not the same role. It's just that when you have partnerships, they often get conflated with each other, which creates a lot of confusion. And so separating that out, especially with roles and compensation, is important. I talk about that in other places. But I just want to put that out there that when there's clarity around roles and responsibilities, and those are developed in alignment with values, vision, and priorities, that resolves most potential disputes that you'll run into in your organization. So part of what you want to think about is if you needed to go away or you wanted to go away, you wanted to take a 1-month vacation, would it be really obvious to you and everyone else what responsibilities you needed to hand off to someone else to cover your job while you were gone? If that's not clear to you or is very confusing, then that's an opportunity to create that clarity, and it'll help strengthen your partnership. So partnerships don't fail because business is hard. They fail because people avoid having hard conversations. If you want frameworks that will help you build clarity, help you protect your relationships, and scale without partnership drama, visit christianmuntean.com. On my website, I have tons of tools that will help you build healthy leadership teams and strong, sustainable businesses. The link is below in the description. The fourth aspect or fourth characteristic of a healthy partnership is looking at people's communication and conflict habits. Conveniently, I wrote a book called Conflict and Leadership, which goes into this at significant depth. So I encourage you to get a copy of that if this is something that you're wrestling with. And given the fact that most people wrestle with communication and conflict issues at some point, it's usually pretty useful. But here's the thing that you want to look for, and it ties to what I was talking about with character. There are many things to say about both communication and conflict. The main thing that I look for with a partner in this space is in communication as you're trying to get to clarity and understanding. And if there's conflict or disagreements, do people maintain an attitude of respect? I was talking about that up here. And do they keep working towards a solution, or do they try to either win and beat you, or do they shut down and just sort of disappear and not talk? Either of those, that desire to win and beat you, or the have to always be right, maybe is another way of saying that, or if they just tend to shut down and not want to communicate or talk, either of those tendencies are often recipes for an unhealthy relationship and an unhappy relationship. And so I like to look for people who are open to communicating, understand that sometimes it takes time to get on the same page or to understand each other. And while very few people always handle conflict well from the beginning, I'm looking for people who will stay with it and be committed enough to the relationship that they actually will work through conflict, trusting that they'll come out on the other side at a place of better understanding. The next part of this, and I alluded to it earlier, has to do with agreement around money, decisions, and valuation. So this has to do with really defining mostly the owner role, which we often don't think about. We often go into partnerships and think that the owner role, I just own stock, but I'm working in the company. But what you really want to, as I mentioned earlier, you want to separate out compensation for owners different than how you compensate the operator hat. My recommendation around money, and there's a lot of things to say about money, and I'm just going to put a little bit on your radar, not all of it. One of them is compensation, though, and what I recommend is that the operator side should be compensated at fair market value. So if somebody would normally be paid $100,000 a year for the work that you're doing, then the salary for that person should be $100,000. I know there's people that play different tax games around that, and you might want to do that, but what I recommend is that you keep your nose clean, keep things straight. This is my recommendation because it has downstream impacts on business, particularly valuation, if you have artificially high or artificially low salaries. So I recommend fair market value for your position. You can talk to your advisors and come up with where you want to be on that. But I recommend that you pay the operator a salary, and then you have your distribution or your dividends or however you're structured, whatever the money that the business makes, however profits are divided monthly, quarterly, annually, however that's done, that you separate that out and that you have a clear equation or a clear framework for describing how you're going to determine what those amounts should be. Some companies have a process that I like, which is to set goals for the year that, okay, we think we're going to, this coming year, we think we're going to hit $20 million in revenue. We expect to have 20% profitability. And so our goal is to take a certain amount of that and reinvest it in the business, a certain amount of that and bonus and incentivize the rest of our workforce. And then our goal is for a certain amount of that to be divided up between the partners. I think that kind of approach can be pretty helpful because it starts to structure other thinking and it helps provide a framework for other decision making. Point is, decide in advance how you're going to separate things. Don't wait until the time is there, because that's where conflict really occurs. If you're separated from it and you're kind of emotionally away from that little pot in the bank account, it's easier to make decisions about how to do this. And I would recommend doing this early on in the partnership, or even before you finalize the partnership. Start to develop processes for this. Also, decisions. Who handles what kinds of decisions in the company? Who can bind you to contracts? Who can spend amounts over a certain amount with or without consulting the other person? Who can buy or sell assets? Who can hire or fire, or hire and fire at certain levels? Any of these, or who can bring in new partners, or how are those kinds of things done? That should be clarified. The place that this stuff is usually clarified is in your operating agreement. If you don't have an operating agreement and you're going into a partnership, I don't know how to say it. That's just stupid. You need to have one. You need to have the rules of how you're going to play the game defined as clearly as you can. It protects both of you and it protects the relationship. So if you walk into a partnership and you want to skip the legal stuff, or maybe you just weren't aware of it, well, now you are, and so you're responsible for that knowledge. You want to have this stuff written down, and it'll save you a world of hurt later. And I talk more about that in other videos. The other part you want to define in your partnership is how the company will be valued. Now, some folks want to have a method for valuing the company if they're buying and selling shares while overall retaining ownership. So, for example, a lot of professional firms like engineering firms or medical offices or attorneys' offices will not full on sell their company, but they'll sell some shares to new people coming in. And so they may have a methodology for valuing those shares that might be different than if they were to just sell to, let's say, a large national firm. However you want to do it, and whatever vision you have for your company, you want to anticipate the basic approach that you want to use to valuation. It can be as basic as saying, we will work together to agree to choose someone that will value our company. They need to be certified in valuations, so certified a business appraiser or whatever their title is, or not. You can choose however you want to do it, but it should be spelled out. You can pick a firm if you want to. You can just pick a process. You can agree that if we can't agree, then, partner A gets to choose their person, partner B gets to choose their person. We'll call them both, and whoever's available first in the calendar is who we go with. You can choose ways like that. The point is, build your structure for these and try as best as you can to anticipate not every scenario, because no one can, but anticipate the likely places where you can see potential conflict emerging, and try to get something on paper. A good attorney who is helping you develop your operating agreement should already know a lot of these things. If they're just purely doing boilerplate and they give you and the engineering firm and the restaurant down the street and the gas station and the new medical office all exactly the same operating agreement, same boilerplate, you got problems. They don't need to start from scratch because a lot of this is similar, but you do want them to customize this and understand your business well enough to be able to help you think through this. This is a pretty big deal. It's one of those documents that gets created and then most people never look at it until it becomes super important. Then everybody looks at it. All right, enough said. The other thing, the last point, has to do with this. And this is something that I would say I almost never see in operating agreements. And it's something that pretty consistently catches partners by surprise, which has to do with having a clear exit, and I'll just say it, evolution strategy. Exit and, exit or, evolution and exit, however you want to frame that. The point is if you start a business and you're 25 and you're just killing it, you're doing great, and you're having a lot of fun doing things together, at some point you're going to be 50 or 60 and people's lives will have changed. Kids will have moved across the country. Somebody's health is going to be different. Somebody's priorities or interest or energy levels for your company are going to be different. And that just has to do with natural evolution that people have. And if your operating agreement or your habits of working together don't allow for people to grow and change, it's going to create friction. And that's one of the most common friction points is people have been in business together for 10 or 15 years. Their operating agreement assumed that when we first met and started this, everything was going to stay the same forever. And then reality is nothing stays the same forever. It changes, it grows, it evolves, and the operating agreement doesn't have a mechanism or a simple mechanism to accommodate that. So or an exit, and oftentimes, for example, there's almost no language for exits in many operating agreements. And oftentimes there isn't assumptions like, well, what if we both are working together, operating and owning the business, but maybe 20 years in, once we're making good money and things are operating well and we've done a good job, maybe one of the partners loves showing up for work every day and the other partner doesn't want to do that anymore. They want to do something different. And if that option either isn't discussed or there's no mechanism for having that conversation, and that's never been talked about, it creates lots of friction. That, what I just described, is one of the most common friction scenarios, is just people kind of growing in different directions. They still want to stay in ownership. Both partners want to be there. They're not wanting to leave relationship with each other, but they want to change some of the dynamics in the relationship. But there's a rigidity to the arrangement that doesn't allow for some of that natural and pretty understandable evolution to happen. And so one of the things you want to begin to think about is you cannot anticipate every possible scenario, but a good operating agreement will have language in it that allows you or even requires you to periodically review your operating agreement and make sure it still makes sense for where you're at right now. An example of this can be language. This can be in the operating agreement or it can just be a policy that you both agree to, that on an annual basis, you both will read through the operating agreement together and then discuss any potential changes that might be needed, so that it's you stay aware of what it says, but B, it allows it to, there's an understanding then when you have that conversation that change might be part of it, and you have some mechanism then that allows that conversation to take place. So one partner isn't the one bringing it up and the other partner is like, where did this come from? I thought things were going to be the same forever. You bake in an understanding that once a year you're going to review, what's working in this agreement, in this partnership, what needs to be added to it, what needs to be stopped, what needs to be changed, so that we can continue together in a way that works for both of us. So every partnership failure that I've seen follows a similar pattern. Character issues, misaligned values, unclear roles, poor communication, money confusion, and no plans for natural evolution or change. Now, to the partners, each scenario tends to feel unique, but these situations are often predictable and preventable. And as I promised earlier, the strongest predictor of a partnership failure or success has to do with the character of the partners involved. In my opinion, it has to do with the combination of humility and perseverance. People who can actually work on growth and change. Partners who stay humble and put effort into growing personally can work through almost anything, whereas partners who become rigid or fixed in their own ways eventually break the relationship regardless of contracts or systems. So now that you know how to avoid the traps that destroy most partnerships, the next step for you is to learn how to build a company that can scale with clarity and confidence, whether you have partners or not. If you click the link on the screen right now, I'll walk you through my $10 million framework for scaling businesses the right way.